Good evening. Welcome to the Travel Plus Club. Our board wanted to bring a little joy and relief to our friends and neighbors during COVID, so we're pleased to offer you a very interesting meeting this evening with a wonderful speaker. Be sure to look for an e-blast and also in the view regarding the Travel Plus Club's next program, which will be on Saturday, January 30th at 7:30 p.m. via Zoom. The board's working on exciting programs for the year, such as Jukebox Bingo, Italy Travel and its olive oil, a travel doctor to answer all our COVID and travel and vaccine questions, and more. Also in the view will be our membership flyer for 2021. If you were a member in 2020, you're automatically a member in 2021, and nothing needs to be done. If you'd like to join the club, you can pay your 2021 dues of $15 and join us. Email me if you have any questions, supersecdd@aol.com. Thank you to Jason Doskow for being at the helm tonight and always being there to so pleasantly answer all my questions. I have a lot. Thank you to club member and neighbor Adrian Bergen, who's helping out, and to Gary Dalen, board member, who's also helping. And if you know anybody who's having trouble getting in tonight, they should call Adrian's house or Gary's cell. You can ask questions in the Q&A tab, and you can chat in the chat tab. And you can ask Dr. Watson a question about anything that you would like, because there's so much going on in the world. Now, I'd like to tell you, if there's anybody out there who doesn't know Dr. Robert Watson, he was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and attended public schools in nearby Hershey, which is the city that the Travel Plus Club learned about at our presentation on chocolate way back in January. It feels like January 2020 was eons ago instead of just months ago. Dr. Watson was an athlete who was able to attend Virginia Tech on scholarship, and he is first and foremost a historian, and almost all of his books are in that vein. He's currently writing a book about an early pandemic that caused the evacuation of the Capitol. Dr. Watson co-convened several national conferences on the American presidency, co-founded the annual Truman Legacy Symposium, and served on the board of the Harry S. Truman Foundation, among other foundations. But only that foundation is important to me because I'm from Missouri and share Watson's admiration for Harry Truman. I'm your Truman groupie. Dr. Watson is also a political commentator and has been on TV, radio, newsprint, and on the lecture circuit as a raconteur possessing great wit and charm. He holds the title Distinguished Professor of American History at Lynn University in Boca Raton. He also has a rock band in which he sings and plays guitar. For our purposes tonight, Dr. Watson is also a world traveler. He has led study tours to historic sites around the US and internationally. Tonight, he has brought along his travel partner, Commodore Travel. Claudia Mace and Sandy Wolf tell me that Commodore Travel consultants have been in business over 40 years. Commodore are members of Oasis Travel Network and affiliated with Palm Coast Travel, a member of Signature Travel Network. Commodore is the exclusive agency that represents Dr. Watson's group travel. I believe this is the first time that Dr. Watson has spoken to a group about the importance of place and preserving the places we tour. So please go to the reactions tab on your device and click on the clapping icon to join me in welcoming the Travel Plus Club's tour guide for this evening, Dr. Robert Watson.
Thank you, Debbie. What a nice introduction and what a clever introduction. I want to thank Debbie, and I want to thank Jason again. I've had the pleasure of working with Jason in the past, and Gary and Adrian. Thanks for helping out. So You're from Mizzou. Well, Debbie, you just went up even more points in my book. As you know, Harry Truman's my hero. Probably one of the reasons why I'm an historian is because of Truman, and had the great honor, as you heard Debbie say, of serving on the Truman Foundation Board for 2 decades now. And this could be the first year in that time that I don't make my annual pilgrimage to Missouri to visit Independence, to visit Truman's home at 219 North Delaware Street, and his presidential library, and his favorite little drugstore where he'd go to get a soda pop. That was called the Clinton Drugstore. So 2020 could very well break my record of going every year for probably 25 plus years. So look forward to getting back to Mizzou. Yeah, I was raised in Hershey, Pennsylvania, the sweetest place on earth, Chocolate Town, USA. If anybody's been there, it's a charming place. It's well worth a visit. There's a wonderful zoo and a museum and Chocolate World, and of course the chocolate factory and a park, wonderful theater. It's a wonderful town. When I was in college, I spent all my summers interning at the chocolate factory, and I worked my way up to being the tour guide of the chocolate factory. So I was literally Willy Wonka for a couple of years. I used to give all the tours of the chocolate factory. But I'm delighted to be with everybody. As I'm talking, I put a PowerPoint together for you. And yeah, this is a new one here for me. As you heard Debbie say there, I hope you all can see that, okay? So I'm delighted to talk to Debbie and all of you in the Travel Club, because other than history and my children, my guess is that my great passion on earth is travel. I absolutely love to travel. I'm guessing a lot of you are like me in that I've made so many cross-country road trips. I've probably done, I'm guessing 8 Atlantic to Pacific, just driving across the country. And you all remember the AAA maps, right? I write to the American Automotive Association. My students think that's a hoot. Maps, not a smartphone. And I'd get them to map out a route for me. And every time I went across country, I'd find a different battlefield, presidential home, historic site, something. And I would hit those all along the way. So I absolutely love traveling. For the last few months and years, I've been working with Commodore Travel. They organize cruises. They've done wonderful riverboat cruises on luxury lines like Uniworld, now also AMA Waterways, to do the Rhine and the Seine and the Danube. And we also do theme-based cruises, one for the 75th anniversary of D-Day a year and a half ago, a Jewish heritage, and all sorts of fun cruises. So travel is my real passion. So obviously 2020 has been difficult for me, not being able to get out and get about. I typically travel to a museum or an historic site or battlefield every 3rd week. Typically I take a 3, 4, 5 day long weekend. About every 3rd week, I have a wonderful vice president and provost on campus who's lets me do that, lets me take these long weekends. And I love to go to these places, and I usually give lectures, conduct research, meet with area school teachers and train them about the historic site, train the staff, the docents of the battlefields and homes and all that. So I am really, really, really missing that and my travel bug. So it's exciting to be with all of you, and that it's going to make me even want to travel more. So let's jump into this. Here's what I did. I sat and made a list of, I don't know how many I put, 10 to 20, probably more, sites around the country that I think as an historian, I've been very big on telling my students, especially when I have graduate students, that you have to actually visit the site. You can't really know something or someone, a battle, for example, until you've walked around the battlefield. I'm very big on that. I even try to go during the time of the year when the battle occurred. And by visiting so many sites across the country and across the world, I think I've been to 47 of the states and maybe 65 or 70 countries. It provides insights that you simply can't get from a textbook. So I wanted to talk about the importance of place, both for understanding history, but also experiencing culture, which a lot of you like to do. And to start, I just had a couple of places that are some of my favorites that they became even more special to me once I visited them. The Grand Canyon. You would all agree with me that no matter how many photos or images you see or documentaries you see of the Grand Canyon, there is nothing quite like walking out the very first time. Am I right, everybody? And looking out at the Grand Canyon. I took my son and daughter out there a couple of years ago, and I had shown them photos. We talked about the natural history. We talked all about the canyon, the native people of the region. And my son, when we went out there, he stood speechless for probably 10 minutes. He said, "Dad, I could never imagine anything like this." So I think the Grand Canyon is one of those places you've got to visit. Another one is seeing a grizzly bear in person. There's nothing quite like it. I love Yellowstone. I love all the parks out west. I taught previously in my career at Northern Arizona University, which is near the Grand Canyon, and at Stanford. So I spent a lot of time visiting those wonderful states like Utah and Colorado and Wyoming, the magnificent parks out west. And I'm a big wildlife person. I was, contemplating being a naturalist or a wildlife biologist earlier in my career. But seeing a grizzly bear, I mean, it's something the size of a van. It's just amazing. And of course, these people are absolutely playing with natural selection by being that close to the grizzly bear. So I put that on my list of things that you have to experience to really appreciate. I taught at the University of Hawaii for 5 years. And this is the top of Mauna Kea. Has anybody been to the islands, been to Hawaii, or been to the top of Mauna Kea, which is on the Big Island, the world's preeminent astronomical observatory and site? There's roughly a dozen world-class, gigantic telescopes, and radar observatories on top of Mauna Kea. It sits well above the clouds, as you can see from this picture, in the 12 to 14,000 foot range. And when I was at the University of Hawaii, I was probably 1 month into my job as a professor there. And we had a meeting, and it was a meeting that I literally, my jaw fell open and I couldn't believe it. This was back in the 90s, early and mid 90s. So it's before Zoom, it's before, all these online programs that can be used for educational purposes. So what each island had a designated branch campus, typically a rec center or a library. And the university was experimenting with what they called HTV, just for Hawaii TV, where they could beam lectures and beam content through a television to a library or a rec center. But what they did is they needed professors to go around and actually show up in person. I mean, it gives it a more personalized feel, plus to answer questions, for advising, to help students register for classes. So they said, look, we need someone to go to all the islands on the weekends and do this. And I'm 1 month into my professorship at the University of Hawaii, and I'm a junior professor. So I look around thinking everybody's going to jump at it. Everybody was bumbling, oh, I don't want to have to fly around. So I raised my hand and said, are you kidding me? I'll do that. So back then they had 2 airlines, Aloha and Hawaiian, servicing the islands. And I got a big stack of what they called Kama'aina tickets. Kama'aina literally means love of the land. It loosely means local. So if you're a local Hawaiian, you call yourself Kama'aina. And if you're a newcomer, you're a Hali, which is a negative word for whites, or a Malahini, which means newcomer. So I took the big book of tickets, and every weekend I'd fly around to all the islands. I think I knew every square inch of the Hawaiian Islands till I left there. But one of my absolute favorite is this. There's nothing that can prepare you for being up at 14,000 feet on the top of the world's tallest volcano. Mauna Loa is the world's biggest volcano. Mauna Kea is the world's tallest volcano. Mauna Kea means mountain white, or white mountain, for all the snow. And you can see a little bit of snow up there. It is just an otherworldly experience. And you can see for miles and miles. You can see other islands. You can see the ocean. You can look down and see the rainforest on the windward side of the islands, and the desert on the leeward side of the island. So that's a place you really have to visit. Another one is Giverny. Has anybody been to Monet's home at Giverny? I took some pictures. This is not a good one because it was sadly on my first visit when I took a lot of photos, it was a little overcast. But I've always liked Monet's paintings, and I like Impressionism, and just the colors and the flowers. I think it's beautiful. We have some Monet prints in our house. But there's nothing quite like being there and seeing the dance, the interplay of light and color and the different times of the day at Monet's home. And here's a couple on the left, actual photos, and on the right, paintings. And just the explosion, the kaleidoscope of colors. And my first visit, we stayed most of the day. So from the morning through midday to the late afternoon when they were closing, it just changed dramatically with the interplay of light and color. So that's a place I think you have to visit. I've got one or two more, of course, Versailles, right? How many folks have been to Versailles? I saw photos. I knew it was opulent. I knew it was excessive. I knew it was indescribable. But when you first walk down the Hall of Mirrors, there's nothing that can quite prepare you for it. And talk about the interplay of light and color and all that. And of course, just the extraordinary entrance, which this photo doesn't do it justice because it doesn't capture the scope and the size of Versailles. So those are some of my favorite places to visit. And I think you have to visit. I think the last one I have here is Paris at night. Am I right, Debbie? You have to get
yeah.
to Paris at night. Yeah. The City of Lights, Paris. I was lucky, and when I was getting my PhD, I spent a semester in England and in France studying, and it was my favorite semester of my entire college experience. And I love Paris, who doesn't? But there's something about night in Paris. I've been to a lot of cities that have a wonderful display of lights that seem to come to life, that seem to have a character all to their own at night, but nothing quite like Paris at night. Of course, Notre Dame. So what I wanted to do is talk about how visiting locations changes the historical understanding and changes the cultural experience. And one of them is a site near where I grew up in Gettysburg, Pickett's Charge, right, everybody? The Battle of Gettysburg, the pivotal battle in 3 days in early July of 1863. This is the South's invasion of the North. And this is about as far up as the South as a large army would get into invading the North. Gettysburg was critical. It lies at the midway point, the halftime, the midway point of the war. And what Lee's plan was is once he invaded Pennsylvania, which is known as the Keystone State, as Pennsylvania goes, so goes the rest of the Union. He was going to then march down what is now the Turnpike to Philadelphia, and therefore take what was perhaps the country's most important city. From there, straight into Baltimore and into Washington, D.C., and either capture or kill Abraham Lincoln. And that could have changed the complexion of the war or ended the war in horrific ways. So Gettysburg was absolutely critical. Robert E. Lee, I think when you visit Gettysburg, he goes down several notches in esteem. I think Lee, even to the point where I have argued over probably most of my career, that Lee is perhaps one of the most overrated Americans in history. One of the cardinal rules of combat is the high ground carries the day. You need to take the high ground. Lee marches into Gettysburg with a massive army of 80,000 men, and there's two mountains, Big Round Top and Little Round Top. He does not seize the high ground. Instead, he fiddles and faddles and fools around and allows the Union, who arrived hours later under General Meade, to get the high ground. Lee would then spend 3 days trying to march and charge and fight uphill. And thank goodness he was unsuccessful. But I think the biggest screw up was here at Pickett's Charge. Day 3, after these two armies of 80 to 90,000 in blue and 70 to 80,000 in gray meet in one of the largest battles on this continent, and Lee has lost everything. So he has a desperate charge. He asks General George Pickett to line up 12,500 men on day 3 and charge the Union line. On the left, I put a photo from a textbook. A painting from a textbook. Pickett's charge, I think you would all agree, is cloaked in romance and heroism in textbooks. It's seen as this gallant final charge by honorable, genteel officers and brave soldiers. So it's painted, it's depicted very romantically and heroically. No, it is absolute folly. It's idiocy. It's a suicide mission. On the right is an image of Pickett's charge that the Union officers sitting on horseback, this is what they would have seen. So 12,500 Confederates go into the tree lines at the distance of that image. And they sit there all morning. Mind you, it's July. It's 80 plus, 90 plus degrees. They're wearing wool uniforms. They're running out of water. Lee has his men wait for hours, which is foolish at best, suicidal at worst. The whole time that the Confederate Army is waiting, the Union is pummeling them with artillery. Many of the men complained that they could not hear by the time of the charge because of all the explosions around them. Finally, after hours of being pummeled, running out of water, standing in wool uniforms in the heat, they decided to charge up the hill. The charge was an orderly walk. And over 1,000 men are killed, over 4,000 are wounded, and roughly 4,000 are taken prisoner. So it is catastrophic. Here's an image. As you can see, Pickett's charge angles uphill. So they're fighting uphill across a wide open field with Union artillery, and the Union is dug in behind defenses, just firing volley after volley after volley at the Confederates. So it's, I think when you visit the site, you get a lot less, esteem for Robert E. Lee, and you realize how foolish this was. The Alamo. Anybody been to the Alamo? Near San Antonio. So the Alamo is an iconic part of American history. March of 1836, in March of 1836, Texas, roughly 160 to 180, we're not sure. The numbers vary on the counts, and most folks inside were not able to get word out. So 160 to 180 Texicans dug in against Santa Anna's army of about 2,500. So they were grotesquely outmatched, outgunned, and all that. And they put up about a 24-hour resistance. And on March 6th, all but about one account says one, another account says two. So all but one or two of them are killed. I think the Alamo is also cloaked in romance and heroism. And there you can see from the images on the right, the likes of Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett and others swinging their guns and fighting to the last man. It's actually quite foolish. The Alamo is, when you go there, shockingly small, right, everyone? It is so small. Here's an image I have, an artist's depiction of what it would have looked like back then. It's very small, low walls that can easily be breached by ladders. The adobe is a very soft stone, so with the artillery from Santa Anna's cannons, many of the walls were blown down. It's indefensible, quite frankly. So Travis, the colonel who led the mission, is depicted as a great hero in history. The guy was absolutely brave, but foolish. So when you go to see the Alamo, you realize what a foolhardy effort it is. Lake Champlain. This is in September 11th, 1814, in the War of 1812, a war that lasted 3 years, but was named for only one of them. So crazy war. So by the end of the war, what had happened in the short was that the Americans, the United States, invaded Canada time and time again for 2 years, trying to seize Canada. It was an invasion that was prompted by a lot of Southern war hawks who wanted to expand slavery to the Southwest, to Canada, and all across the continent. Southern war hawks also wanted to commit genocide against the American Indian. So by invading Canada, it would give them cover to slaughter the indigenous peoples of the continent. So the War of 1812 was not a very noble war. This is why our textbooks usually gloss over it, because it's such an embarrassment. So for 2 years, we tried to invade Canada, and we had armies 2, 3, and 4 times the size of the British and Canadians, and yet they beat us back every single time. At the end of the war, something happened. Napoleon was finally defeated in Europe. The British saw the War of 1812 as a distraction. Americans were a pesky little bug to be flicked off. They were worried about Napoleon and a continental-wide war against a real adversary in Europe. When Napoleon is finally defeated, the British turn their attention to America, and they sail a massive army across the Atlantic. Now, the Americans, who enjoyed 2, 3, 4 times the advantage, now the British have a 2, 3, 4, 5 times a numerical advantage. And they plan to invade us in the center at Washington and Baltimore and burn the capital city, which they did. They planned, secondly, a prong to invade us at New Orleans and up the Mississippi, and thirdly, from Canada in the north. So there'd be a central prong, a southern prong, and a northern prong. The northern prong was going to come down from New York at Plattsburgh and Lake Champlain between New York and Vermont and hit us. So the British spent months building a navy on the lake, and they finally, on September 11th, sailed down to destroy the American Navy. Wasn't much of a navy. There was a young man named Thomas Macdonough. He was an Irishman who changed the spelling of his name to give the impression that he was a Scot. He sided with us. He has 3 small warships with a few cannons and about 10 gunboats. What's a gunboat? It's a little fishing boat, and they strap a cannon on the front of it and call it a gunboat. So not much of a navy. And this is what Macdonough has to fight the British Navy. He's done, right, everybody? No. He played on the British vanity, and he understood the lake. Look at the image I have on the right there. That's a map of the lake. Here's what Macdonough knew. The British spent all their time building ships rather than studying the lake. They were so overconfident, their vanity, that they were going to sail down and annihilate the Americans in a matter of minutes. Can you see how the lake kind of comes and it's like a fish hook? You see that in the middle? There's a piece of land. The British were sailing down by the fish hook. Here's what Macdonough knew. When they get down to the bottom of the fish hook, they're going to have to turn and sail up. Well, a couple of things. Number one, there's a high hill, a mountain at the fish hook. So the British can't see around it. They're sailing blind. When they turn around the fish hook, they were going to face headwinds and headwaters, which means the sails are going to fall limp and the ships cannot be navigable. They cannot be maneuvered. So the British are sailing blind. All of a sudden they face headwaters and headwinds, and they're sitting ducks. What Macdonough did is he took a small navy of a small flotilla of just over a dozen ships, and he put them side by side by side in a row. Bow, stern, bow, stern, bow, stern. And he hitched them all together. He dropped anchor. Now, he aimed all of his cannons at where the British were going to come. Sure enough, the British come sailing around the corner, and what do they face? 13 boats with cannons just firing at the British. The British tried to maneuver their ships to fire back, but they couldn't because they were facing headwinds and headwaters. Macdonough ordered his men to fire, reload, fire, reload. As the ships were connected, he also dropped anchors and connected winches to them. So rather than have to sail the ships, he would fire, and as the British ships were floating by, he winched the ship to turn the angle, fire, winch, reload, fire, winch, reload. And in under an hour, he sunk the entire British Navy. So it was one of the great upset victories in history. And here you can see the point I'm talking about. So the British are at the mid-right of your image there, and they go sailing down there, and you see the point jutting out. They can't see around it. They turn that corner, and that's where Macdonough hit them. So when you go to Lake Champlain to visit Champ, our version of the Loch Ness Monster, right, everybody? A beautiful lake. When you go there, you can see the folly of what the British did. Another is the Battle of New Orleans from the same war, War of 1812. This is the last major battle of the war, January 8th, 1815. There's an artist's depiction on the right. I want to draw your attention to the left. The Battle of New Orleans is seen as again, a romanticized, heroic battle. General Sir Pakenham, with over 8,000 British regulars, basically special forces, some of them, the army that defeated Napoleon, are taking on Andrew Jackson, who has about 3,000 irregulars, volunteers, mountain men, a couple slaves, a couple of Indians, a couple of French and Spanish residents of New Orleans. Talk about a hodgepodge army. So Jackson has to take on 8,000, and he has maybe 4,000 till you count all the locals, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000. Look at the map on the left. So do you see the blue line on the far left? That's Jackson's line. Now, what's smart about Jackson's line is on one side is the Mississippi River. Y'all see that at the bottom? On the top side is a cypress swamp, which means the British can't outflank him because they can't go through a swamp. Anybody tried to run through a swamp or march an army through the Everglades? They can't outflank him on the bottom because there's the Mississippi River. There's only one way they can hit him, is straight up the gut. Well, straight up the gut, you can see the red arrows. That's a swamp also. It's a flat, open, bog, marsh, wetland. So the British are knee deep in muck, losing their boots, trying to walk through the muck. Jackson annihilates the British. When you go there and you see the lay of the land, you realize how foolish General Sir Pakenham was to try to hit him in his defenses. The other thing Jackson did was he didn't build a fort because cannonballs could blow down a wooden fort. Jackson ordered his men to make that blue line that you're looking at on the left of the map is a giant, what's called an earthworks. It's a big mound of mud. And Jackson's men just laid on top of the mound of mud or behind it. When the British shot cannonballs into the mound of mud, they just went and were sucked into the mound of mud, and some didn't even blow. So here's a picture today of what that cypress swamp just above it looks like. Could you imagine trying to go through that? So by visiting New Orleans, you can get a sense of this dramatic battle. The British suffered, get this, well over 2,000 casualties. How many Americans died? 13. Wow. One of the biggest upsets in history, but you visit it and you realize the lay of the land. Custer's last stand, right? Everybody, 1876. Anybody been out there to Montana? Summer of June of 1876. So it's the Battle of Little Bighorn. General George Armstrong Custer has a few hundred cavalrymen from the 7th Cavalry. He's going up against a few thousand warriors from the Lakota, the Arapaho, the Dakota tribes. He's going against Two Moons. He's going against Sitting Bull. He's going against Crazy Horse. You probably have heard of these names. So he's going up against some of the greatest chiefs, native chiefs in our history, and an army of thousands of warriors. Now, Custer is so arrogant that he's told, wait until you get enough reinforcements and enough supplies. Also, wait until you get a relatively new weapon. Custer won't wait for the weapon. He wants all the glory. He wants to beat all the other American officers in there. He wants to be the one who defeats the Indians. What was the weapon he was waiting for? Has anybody seen a Gatling gun? It sits on a tripod. It's an early machine gun. If he had one or two Gatling guns, he could have mowed down all several thousand of the Indians, and that would have been the end of it. But he races on. Even more so, Custer's jealous of one of his other officers. So he divides his army in two, and with only 200 to 300 men, he's chasing this massive Indian army. Now, the painting on the left, you've all seen the movies, right? You've all seen the depiction in film and textbooks. It's completely inaccurate. It shows Custer picks the ground, has his men surround him, and there they make their final last stand. He didn't pick the ground. If you look at the map on the right, in blue is Custer. This battle in June of 1876. It took place over several miles. Custer is riding for his life, chased by thousands of Indians. We have archaeological evidence. There are bullets, arrowheads, and bones stretched out for miles. If you follow the bullets, the arrowheads, and the bones, you can follow the path of Custer's retreat. He was running for his life as he's being chased. He doesn't pick the ground. Ultimately, his last horses are shot out from under them. So what they do is the men pile the horses up and try to get behind them, and that's Custer's last stand. First off, it was idiotic to even fight the battle. Here's what it looks like. How are 200 or 300 men going to take on thousands when there's no place to hide, when there's no way to sneak up on them, when there's no way to use the lay of the land? Here's some graves of some of Custer's men. It's believed the one in the middle may have been Custer, but we just don't know, as the short answer of it. So Custer's last stand, when you visit it, it's again folly. And when you visit it, you realize it was miles over a prairie, not the way it's depicted in movies. The Golan Heights, anybody been to Israel?
Yep.
Anybody been to the Golan?
Yep.
Which is, there's a map near the Lebanon and Syrian border. This is from the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the Valley of Tears, right? So one of the first things I said when I started talking was the importance of the high ground. In military history, the person that gets the high ground almost always wins. There's been a lot of talk for years of why doesn't Israel give back the Golan? Israel would be absolutely foolish to give back the Golan. It's the high ground. The Syrians or Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, they could use the high ground and just rain artillery fire down on Israeli settlements, farms, and so on. So they wouldn't give up the high ground. There you can see on the right a Syrian tank that was destroyed. The Syrians mobilized several thousand tanks and hundreds of pieces of artillery. The Israelis, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, were grotesquely outnumbered. Israel had maybe 170 tanks and maybe 60 artillery pieces to go up against thousands. The Syrians had many, many, many times over advantage in men. And during this several-day fight, by day 3, the IDF was running out of gas. They were running out of ammo. They were running out of men. But they inflicted so much damage on the Syrians that, thank goodness, on day 3, Syria withdrew, and that was the end of the fight for the Golan. Syria lost over 500 tanks. They lost thousands of men. So the Israelis really punched above their weight, as we say in sports. But you go to the Golan today, everybody, and you can realize how difficult the terrain is. If Israel were to give it up, not only would their enemies have the high ground, but it would be darn near impossible to dislodge an enemy if the Syrians or the Lebanese or whomever really, really dug in there because of the high ground. Here's an image just to give you some sense of the high ground and the artillery fire that could rain down and the strategic advantages of having that. So I think when somebody visits, I took a tour group there years ago, and we toured an IDF base, and we toured some of the tanks, and they took us to the forward staging ground where we saw some of the casualties from that battle in 1973. And when you go and you walk around there, then you realize why Israel doesn't give up the high ground. So I think it's yet another important place to visit. The Sage of Monticello, that would be Thomas Jefferson. Has anybody been to Monticello?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, beautiful. Even though I've never liked Thomas Jefferson, anybody out there that knows me, I'm partial to Washington, Franklin Adams, and Hamilton. Never liked Jefferson. But still, Jefferson was a Renaissance man, a polymath. You know, America's Leonardo. He spoke several languages. He was an accomplished violist. He had the largest library in the country, the largest collection of wines. He was a botanist. He was an architect. He was a biologist. Jefferson was a true polymath. And his home, I would argue, might be the most important home in the United States. It is more than a home, everybody. It's a link to the past. It's a veritable time machine, and it's a museum. Remember, in the early 1800s, Jefferson was president from 1801 to 1809. It was Jefferson that sent Lewis and Clark west. And Lewis and Clark were two of the most impressive Americans ever to live. He sent them west to, of course, find a route. And a lot of you have probably retraced part of it. When I was in the Dakotas and Montana, that part of the country, I once retraced the Lewis and Clark route to follow it. It's a lot easier in a car today. So they were to find a passage to the Pacific. They were supposed to make treaties with the American Indians. But part of why Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark west was his own intellectual curiosity. Meriwether Lewis was a polymath, just like Jefferson. He sketched all the plants and animals. Like when I was a kid, and when you were all kids, and you put a flower or a leaf in a notebook and press it, he sent those back. He studied the flora and fauna. Clark was a great map maker, and he made maps that were accurate and used for decades after the Lewis and Clark expedition. If you go to Jefferson's home today, you can see, here's an image of the inside. It is filled with Lewis and Clark's artifacts, American Indian items, and moose and elk and a grizzly bear hide and rock samples and strata. So it's a museum from Lewis and Clark. Also, you see inside Monticello that thing on the right. Jefferson was an inventor also. And he invented one of the first copy machines. What he did was Jefferson liked to write. He wrote thousands of letters. And of course, as they rap in the musical Hamilton, he had the skill with the quill, just like Hamilton. What he would do is the image you're looking at, like a draftsman's table, he would tack down two pieces of paper. Then the quill that he was using, by a pulley, he attached it to another quill. So when he wrote, every time he wrote, there was a companion quill writing it. So when he had a letter, he always had a copy of the letter. And you can see all these amazing inventions inside Monticello. Now, the other reason why Jefferson made copies is because he was a megalomaniac. Jefferson had an enormous ego, and he didn't trust the people he was sending his letters to preserve his brilliance. So he made sure he preserved it for us. So this amazing home was almost lost in 1781 during the Revolutionary War, which lasted from 1775 to 1783. The British, under Lord Cornwallis and Benedict Arnold, after he flipped sides, marched into Virginia. One of their goals was to capture or kill the governor of Virginia, one Thomas Jefferson. So they set off in June of 1781 to capture Jefferson. Now, not only did they ride fast, it was a cavalry, it was a mounted unit, but it was a guy named Banastre Tarleton. Has anybody heard that name from history? Banastre Tarleton. I apologize for mentioning his name because I never liked the guy, but Mel Gibson, do you remember the movie The Patriot, everybody? Mel Gibson was supposed to be a guy named Francis Marion from South Carolina, who was known as the Swamp Fox. That was supposed to be Mel Gibson's character. And it turns out to be a good pick for Mel Gibson because Francis Marion was a racist and a bigot and a slave owner and a horrible person. Do you remember there was a British officer who had like a fancy green felt hat, and he was Oxford educated, but just cruel? That was supposed to be Banastre Tarleton. And I really liked the depiction of him in the movie. This guy was brilliant, educated at Oxford and Cambridge, but he would actually burn civilians' houses down. Do you remember in the movie that he put a group of people in a church and lit it on fire? And everybody goes, the British wouldn't have done that. They would drink tea with their pinky up and fight a gentlemanly war. Not Banastre Tarleton. He attacked civilians and murdered people in cold blood. So Banastre Tarleton, with his dragoons, his cavalry unit, they're racing to Monticello. A local farm guy who's in his early 20s named Jewett, he learns about this and he rides 40 miles exchanging horses without taking a break. He becomes the Paul Revere of Virginia. He arrives at dawn and warns Jefferson that Banastre Tarleton and a group of malicious cavalrymen are on their way. With about 10 minutes to go, Jefferson flees Monticello and escapes capture or death. Banastre Tarleton, since he couldn't capture Jefferson, his orders were to burn Monticello. But remember, Banastre Tarleton is an architect and a Renaissance man. He falls in love with Monticello. All he does is drink all of Jefferson's wine and then spares the home. Thank goodness. So the father of his country, George Washington. Look at the images here. Washington towers over horses, towers over the battlefield, towers over cannons. Washington is oftentimes painted and depicted larger than life. If you extrapolate the size of Washington, he would be about 9 or 10 feet tall. He would dwarf Shaq. But we have a need, I think, to make our heroes bigger than life. Look at these images of Washington. He's a mountain. He's a Greek god. Now, fortunately, we know how big Washington is. If anybody been to Mount Vernon, Washington's home?
Yes.
If you go to Mount Vernon, here's what you can find. 2 things. One, Washington had a doctor named Dr. Craig. He was a Scotsman who served in the war with him. And 2 of his physicals of Washington exist. He wrote everything down. He weighed, measured Washington. What we know is Washington had size 13 shoes. That's very big for today, but for back then, he's a monster. In one report, Dr. Craig lists George as 6'1", and in the other report, he lists him at 6'3". So as an historian, I assume 2 things. Number 1, Washington was 6'2", I split the difference. And number 2, Dr. Craig was a lousy physician. Also, we have Washington's clothing is there. If anybody's met me, and a lot of you I know, I'm pretty tall. I'm a little over 6'2", and I weigh about 235 pounds. I could wear Washington's shoes and his jacket. Washington, after looking at his, and I've asked the people at Mount Vernon for 25 years, can I put his clothing on? They won't let me, obviously. But in looking at it, he's the exact same size that I am. So I'm a little bigger and a little taller than average, but Washington was a monster. The other thing is, what they've done at Mount Vernon is they took a death mask of Washington. We have a death mask of Washington, death mask of Lincoln. So we know exactly what they look like. When they die, they put this plaster on them. And they took his clothing, Dr. Craig's descriptions, his physicals, and they've recreated George. And here you can see what Washington would have looked like during the Revolutionary War, based on his clothing, his size, and he's a big man. He's about 6'2". So when you go there, you get an appreciation of who George was. Oh yeah, and he didn't have wooden teeth. He had hippopotamus ivory with human and horse teeth put in them. So that's disgusting, yeah. And we know this because 3 sets of his chompers have survived history. Also, he had a British merchant named Cary, C-A-R-Y, and 2 of George's letters to Cary ordering his hippopotamus ivory dentures have survived history. Here's what we also know. Martha had a matching set of hippopotamus ivory dentures. Isn't that sexy, everybody? Isn't her matching hippopotamus ivory with horse teeth? No wonder George never smiled. Knights in small armor. Let me quick move to a close here. You've all been to the Met or one of the great museums in Europe and seen armor. What we know from looking at the armor is a lot of these knights were about 4'10" to 5 foot tall. So not too imposing. They were small. There's no way in hell I could fit in any set of armor I've ever looked at in all the museums I visited across Europe and across the US. So we see the battles from history where they're jousting with swords. No, that's not how they fought. Those broadswords that they used were about 5 feet long and weighed a lot. They were as tall as, if not taller than, the knights. You need to be the Rock to swing those swords. They are so heavy, there's no fighting with them like this. What they did was they used concussion blasts. You grab the broadsword with 2 hands, and if Debbie and I are fighting, I would just pound on her armor until I knocked her off her feet, and then just pound on the armor until they said, I surrender. So that's the way they fought. So if they knocked you off the horse, you surrendered. If they beat you off your feet and pounded on you, you surrendered. The other reason why is that these suits of armor were not maneuverable. Once you were knocked on the ground, you were like a turtle on your back. You couldn't get up. Each night had like a valet or an aide that rode with them who would help lift them up if they were knocked over. Look at the shoes. These things did not bend. Could you imagine boots up your legs that did not bend at the ankle? How do you run? How do you walk? How do you lunge? How do you jump back and parry? You don't. So it was just primitive concussion blasts with a two-handed sword until someone was knocked over like a turtle, and then they called it a day. The early sailing ships, has anybody been to Jamestown or Plymouth or any of the places and seen these ships? Look at the specs. These things are small. Two observations from seeing the ships. One, you know how little people were back then. Women were maybe 4'6", 4'10", men 4'10" to about 5'3". I've gone on a lot of these recreations of the ships, and I have to duck severely to get in the door. And on more than one, I've had to turn sideways because my shoulders would hit the wall. I can't lay in any of the beds. Could you imagine below decks, 100 or 200 people traveling across the ocean in these small ships? It was cramped, it was dingy, it was miserable. So there's nothing romantic or adventurous about sea travel back then. It was a horrific experience. I think I have two to end. One is D-Day. Has anybody been to the D-Day beaches, the landing beaches in Normandy?
Yes.
I think for us to really appreciate it, we need to go there. So the D-Day beaches in Normandy are about 50 miles wide. And you can see from the map here, it was divided into 5 sectors. The Americans had Utah and Omaha, and the British and Canadians had Gold Sword and Juneau. Omaha was the bloodiest, Utah the least bloody. You can see the Higgins boats there on the left that were used to drop off our men. We had a couple hundred Higgins boats. Dozens of them were blown out of the water and destroyed during the landing. But when you go there and you walk the beach, you realize how utterly heroic these men were. Here's a view of the beach. How do you look at the people walking out by the water. The Normandy beaches in Europe have the highest tidal differential of any coastal area in all of Europe. Has anybody been to the Bay of Fundy in Canada, Nova Scotia? You know how it is the highest tidal differential? So what you could see, look at the water line in this picture I have here. At high tide, where the seaweeds washed up there, at high tide, you would have somewhere between 50 and 100 yards of open beach. At low tide, you could have 200 to 300 yards of open beach. These men had to run across hundreds of yards of open beach. And of course, the hills that you're looking at were rimmed with Nazi machine gun nests and artillery. That is a suicide mission, absolutely shocking. So when you get there and you walk all the way out, as I have with people a couple times, and you walk in, you time how long it takes you to get there. It's absolutely shocking. All those big concrete structures that are out in the water, those are called mulberries. We made something like 150 of them in England. Each one's the size of a 5-story building. And in an amazing feat of engineering, we sailed those across the English Channel and then dropped them in the water, filled them up with water, and they formed like a breakwater, a jetty. So the ships could tie up and not have to deal with these high tides and rough water. You see the ones that are on the beach there? They also laid them end to end. And then what they did is these ran all the way out into the water. You could put a little pontoon bridge on top of it, and they could drive tanks and trucks all the way ashore. So remarkable. When you go there and you see that, and you see that these mulberries are still there over 7 decades later, it's remarkable. And then you can get a picture here, an image of the men coming ashore at low tide, and imagine those hills in front of you just, brimming with machine guns. Absolutely shocking. Try to take those hills, everybody. And you can see at low tide, look how far out the water is and how marshy and wet and swampy the beaches are. This is not hard sand, everybody. This is wet sand full of little tidal pools. And you can see the mulberries still out there in the water. The other thing that's amazing when you go to D-Day is you realize how ambitious the Nazis were. They built the so-called Atlantic Wall. This was built by Rommel, Field Marshal Rommel, the so-called Desert Fox. The Atlantic Wall, everybody, stretches, get this, from Norway to Spain. And you can still see it. It's still standing in many sections. The concrete is 5 to 10 feet thick. The guns are the size of a telephone pole, 88 millimeters. And under each one of these structures, the Nazis built underground barracks. So when we shelled these with naval artillery and dropping bombs from bombers, it inflicted almost no damage. It just blew the top 2 feet of concrete off. And the Nazis simply went underground and then emerged when we landed. Here's one of those guns that's the size of a telephone pole. I'm tall. If I were to squeeze in there, my head would be even with that those little, holes to look out of to aim the guns. That's how tall and big these things are. And of course, you really can't appreciate the sacrifice, I think, until you've been to the American Cemetery near Arromanches, right, everybody? Anybody been to the American Cemetery? It's extraordinary. A couple of thousand crosses and dozens of Stars of David. Now, many more men and many more non-Jews and Jews died than are depicted here. Families were given the choice to bring their sons and husbands and brothers home. And while some non-Jews brought their loved ones home, the majority of Jews brought their loved ones home. So by only seeing a few Stars of David, it gives a false impression that less Jews were in the battle than really were the case. I'll end with this one. Save the best for last, Debbie.
Yep.
So this is my buddy, Harry, of course. And Harry is known for his modesty, very simple. I interviewed years ago, about 2 decades ago, I rounded up every former living advisor, secretary, general, speechwriter, lawyer that worked for Truman that was still alive. And I interviewed all of them for the Truman Presidential Library. And the one thing they all said was you could call him Harry. He was so common, so humble, and he knew everyone's name. He treated everybody with such kindness and respect. Let me give you an example. One of the first people I interviewed 2 decades ago, I found one of Truman's secretaries. Her name was Wanda, and she was living over in Sarasota. So I drove over, and she baked me a cake, which was really cute. And she was wearing all these buttons of Truman buttons from 1948. So I told her, I said, Wanda, while I'm setting up a camera to interview you, I want you to be relaxed, at ease. So tell me a story, and then I'll start taping. This is what she told me. Truman had his main secretary, and then there were 4 other women who sat in a cluster of desks. They answered the phones and did the typing. So she said there was no reason for me to interact with the president. One day, she says, I bring in a new photograph of my son. I can't remember his name. Let's say it's John, and he's about 8. She says, Harry Truman, the president comes walking by, and she says, to my horror, he stops and looks at me and says, Wanda. She said, I couldn't believe he knew my name. He says, you have a new photograph on your desk. Who is that? She said, it's my son. And Harry says, well, what's his name? She says, John. Well, tell me about John. She says, well, he's almost 8. He'll be 8 in 9 weeks on, January 23rd or whatever. And Truman says, well, he's a handsome young man. Tell him that Harry says hi. And he laughed and went in his office. Debbie, I'm guessing that you know where I'm going with this. 9 weeks later, Wanda said, Truman comes walking by, and before he walks into his office, he stops and points at her and says, Wanda, today is John's birthday. Tell him Harry said happy birthday. So that's the kind of guy he was. But I think you don't really appreciate the modesty, the humility of Truman, unless if you hear stories like this, if you get a lecture on Truman or you meet people, or if you go to his home at 219 North Delaware Street. Harry and Bess sitting there in the living room, it is such a humble abode. So Debbie, when you're back in Missouri, I want you to go visit. Also, the Truman Library is being renovated now, so they'll have a brand new library next year for you to visit. But when you see their home, it is so ridiculously humble. And Truman turned down speaking fees. He turned down appointments to be on the board of companies. He would always say the same thing. You don't want me, you want the office, and it's not for sale. So just some incredible stuff. Oh, I'll end with this. I forgot about my book. So I had one big, well, I think I've had two big discoveries as an historian. One was this one. So in 1776, the British annihilated George Washington's army in New York. The British had 32,000 men and 9,000 Hessians. Those are the German mercenaries. Washington had 10,000. So Washington is beat out of New York, sent running for his life across New Jersey. The British had a new problem. They won so decisively that they had thousands of prisoners and they didn't know what to do with them. So what the British did was they had some old warships, and it's called hawking, like the Incredible Hulk. If you hawk a ship, you take the mast, the rudders, the wheelhouse, the sails, you take everything off, so it's just a box, a coffin. And what the British did was they hawked these ships, and they turned them into what are called ghost ships, and they filled them with thousands of American prisoners. Then they boarded up the portholes and nailed down the hatch. And what happened in 76 was about 1,000 American prisoners died on just one of these ships. And over the course of the war, thousands more died. Get this, twice as many men died on this one ghost ship than died in combat in the entirety of the Revolutionary War. How about that? Twice as many died on one prison ship just off the coast of Brooklyn. You know where the Brooklyn Navy Yards are, everybody? That's where it was. Then died in combat during the entirety of the war. So we knew about this ship, but it was kind of a mysterious ghost ship. There's one monument to it. Has anybody been to Brooklyn for some good pizza? Anybody been to Fort Greene Park, named for Nathaniel Greene, Washington's general? There's an obelisk there, and that's what you're looking at on the right. It's called the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument. So I wanted to write a book about this, and I was lucky enough to make some good finds. We found a crypt that has the bones of 7,000 of the men that died on the ship. Many, many thousands more died. We also found, I found the British commander, he was a Scotsman named Sproat, S-P-R-O-A-T. We found his diary and his war reports, I'm sorry. And I found in it, he wrote the coordinates of where the ship was. If you go to the Brooklyn Navy Yards today and you overlook, lower Manhattan, there's in Wallabout Bay, you can find the exact coordinates of the ship. So I took a camera crew from National Geographic and they filmed an episode of that Drain the Oceans movie, TV series, if anybody's watched that on the National Geographic channel. So we did an episode. I found the coordinates. They marked it. They had divers go down. They found some wood and nails from the actual ship. We went to the Brooklyn Historical Society, and they had a box for about 150 years. And we found the box, opened it up, and it was containing artifacts from the ship, which is really, really cool. There's the Brooklyn Navy Yard, everybody. Look on the left, you see the pier that comes out with 6 slips for mooring boats. You see that pier? If you look at the end of that little pier where there's 5 boats, at the very end of the pier, that's exactly where the ghost ship was. So we found the location. What's more is based on the ship rotted down into the muck, and all that's left are a couple pieces of ceramic, thousands of bones, a few pieces of wood, and some nails. That's all that's left. But I found 8 diaries of Americans who were imprisoned on it, and they sketched it and described it. And I found, as I said, the British commander. So what his records and the description of the boat. We know the ship was built in 1737, and we know the line of the ship. So based on existing ones and the descriptions, I worked with National Geographic's computer department, and we recreated the ship. Here's what the famous ghost ship would have looked like, everybody. To its measurements, to the iron rails on the windows. Here's the side view of it. You see the accommodation ladder there? The bottom of the ladder, that's the water line. And the ships would bring the American prisoners. They'd go up the ladder. They were beaten, stripped, robbed, and then put down below decks. And here's one more. So we were able to bring the ghost ship back to life and go to the actual site and find things. So that's pretty cool. I just wanted to shamelessly plug my book, Debbie. So there's my book if anybody wants. It won 2 National Book Awards if you want a good read. Okay, so there's the importance of place and how you learn more about history and culture by visiting it. With that, I'd like to do 2 things. I'd like to give Debbie the first question and invite all of you on the chat room to ask me any questions. And then if you want to talk tours and cruising, I'll see if Jason can bring my friend Claudia on and see if we can have her. So let me go and look here and see what we have. So hi, Ann. I've been to all these places several times. Good, Ann, you and me. Yeah, and Patton is buried at Luxembourg. Yep. And he was, after he was killed in a car wreck. Jamie says, you've been to all those places? Thanks. Good. Yeah. Fun. Gary says, oh yeah, Gary's given directions on how to make the text public. Let's see. Yeah, Anne. So Anne, great question. So after my book came out, there's a TV show called Turn. It's about George Washington's spies. And one episode of it, one of the spies gets captured and they take them to the ghost ship and they actually recreate the ghost ship. I didn't watch the whole series Turn. I watched that one episode. And the recreation of it's 50-50. But yeah, it's really cool that they put that in there. Go figure. What else do we have?
Go to the Q&A.
I'm sorry?
Go to the Q&A.
Okay, so I have a list where I'm lecturing or touring. Yeah, we have cruises. We're going to do one to Israel and the Greek islands like Santorini and Mykonos. We have next December of 2021, this December, 1 year from now, Oceania to the Southern Caribbean, leaving from Miami. Oceania's maybe my favorite cruise line. Summer of 2022, we have 2 on the Danube, a Jewish heritage on Uniworld, and AMA Waterways on the lower Danube. The first one has extra nights and visits to Prague, Budapest, Vienna. The second one does the lower Danube, Romania, Transylvania, Bulgaria, the Iron Gates. Those are my 2 favorite river lines. So, okay, so it looks like I got those. Let me go to Q&A and see if anybody has a question for me. Can you tell us about your 2 new books? Thanks, Steve. Wow. It's like I gave him $20 earlier to say that. So you can see 2 of my books shamelessly featured, The Ghost Ship of Brooklyn, which is the story I told you about, the unknown bloodiest event in the Revolutionary War, which that won 2 National Book Awards. And over here on this side is the Nazi Titanic, which also won an award. It's about the final days of the Holocaust. The unknown story about the Nazis using an ocean liner that was a replica of the Titanic to make it a floating concentration camp. It would end up being the single bloodiest hour of the entire Holocaust, maybe history's worst maritime disaster, and the final tragedy of World War II. And it was all sealed, top secret, classified in the Royal Archives in London for decades. And by dumb luck, that was my other discovery. I put these 2 books up because those are the 2 interesting things I've been able to find. I found evidence of it, and we were able to eventually get the British government to declassify the documents and share 700 plus pages with me to write this crazy book. The 2 new books, and thanks for asking, one's out in February. It's called George Washington's Final Battle, and that's with Georgetown University Press. So I'm excited about that. And then the other one, it's called Escape, and it'll be out in May. It's about the largest prison break in American history, which occurred during the Civil War. The Confederates had a horrible prison, a wretched facility in Richmond called Libby. It was nicknamed the Castle of Despair or the Bastille of the Confederacy. And they only put the highest ranking political prisoners and Union officers in it. And the Confederates used this prison for propaganda and for entertainment. They gave tours of the prison like a zoo with American officers lying in their own feces down to 100 pounds like in a concentration camp. And the Confederates would laugh at them and throw stuff and give tours to other Southerners and say, you see General so-and-so? There he is. He's not so ferocious, is he? Then they used it for propaganda to say the Northerners are so weak. It was actually, has anybody heard of Andersonville? It was a lot like Andersonville. So this is this shocking prison. And what happened was they made the mistake of capturing a colonel from Pennsylvania named Thomas Rose, who knew about mining. And 80 years before the Great Escape in World War II, he dug a tunnel, and 109 men escaped from the prison. And the South had the largest manhunt other than for John Wilkes Booth. So it's a crazy story. It's called Escape, and it's also one of the few sources ever to be written on this story. So those are the two new ones. So Debbie, questions, comments?
Well, I wanted to know, what do you think should be done with those Confederate statues that were taken down? And what should be done with the ones that were not taken down? What's your opinion?
So as an historian, I'm really nerdy about my monuments, my memorials, and my statues. What I say is we need to differentiate. If they were put there to educate, that's one thing. If they were put there to celebrate, that's another thing. If they were put there to celebrate, they need to come down. If they're put there to educate, they need to stay up. Now, most Confederate statues and memorials were put up in the late 1800s to celebrate the Confederacy during the Lost Cause period, or in the 1920s when the KKK made a resurgence and all that. So most of them are put to celebrate. Now, should crowds tear them down? My God, no, absolutely not. We should have the city councils, county commissions, meet with advisory boards, talk to historians, talk to the community, and make a judgment as to how to take them down. Now, when you take them down, put them up at battlefields, put them in museums, put them at universities. These can be great tools to educate, not to celebrate. We should never remember, the South shredded the US Constitution, declared war on the United States, refused prisoner exchanges, were responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of people wounded. Celebrating Jefferson Davis is worse than celebrating Osama bin Laden, because he did a lot more destruction. They attacked the United States and disrespected the Constitution. But if you've been to Gettysburg, it's full of statues of Union and Confederate generals and soldiers. Leave them all there. So I differentiate, Debbie, between celebrate and educate, but I want them taken down in an orderly manner and put up in universities, museums, and historic sites.
Adrian has a question in the chat.
Okay, let me check here, Adrian. Have you read Scarborough's book? No, I have not yet. It's on my holiday reading. A good friend of mine, Claudia knows, her name's Carolyn. She cruises with us all the time. She's got that as my early holiday present. So in December, when I can finally get my head above water and sleep more than 2 hours a night, I can't wait to pour through it. Now, since I'm a Truman nut and an historian, I'm always worried when non-historians have a book on Truman. Chris Wallace, Joe Scarborough. So there's a couple books that have come out on Truman. Happily, friends of mine who are professors around the country have all called me and they said they do Truman justice. It's a good book. It's accurate enough, you know, because you always worry, Adrian, about a hatchet job on Truman. Fortunately, they said that they treat his decision-making well. They treat his great leadership on things like NATO and the Berlin airlift, statehood for Israel. They said that the topics are not butchered, so I was pleased. So I can't wait to go through it, and I'll probably do what I usually do whenever, you know, celebrities, writers, or people like this write a book about an historical topic. I mark it up, and then I send them a note from me telling them what they got right and what they got wrong. So I'm sure Scarborough will love that. But thanks, Adrian, for asking.
That's funny. What about when you're going to be taking a trip? Do you read any special books or see any special movies before you go to get in the mood or to prepare?
Absolutely. So before we did the D-Day trip, for example, even though I had been there, I rewatched Saving Private Ryan. I rewatched The Longest Day, which is my favorite D-Day movie. I reread the great book by Stephen Ambrose, award-winning book called D-Day. So yeah, even though I had been there, even though I lecture on D-Day in World War II, even though I teach it, I always bone back up. Absolutely, Debbie. So I read, I watch movies just to get myself back into it. I also like to do my research to find out little gems that aren't on the usual tourist path. And this is something Claudia is good about, and Sandy. What we did, for example, 2 years ago when we worked with Uniworld on our D-Day World War II tour and our Jewish Heritage Tour, we were going right by, for example, the bridge at Remagen on the Rhine River. Anybody seen that movie, the bridge at Remagen? So I had the great good fortune, one of my mentors, he died 3 years ago at 102. He was the oldest, last living of the senior Truman aides. Name was Dr. Ken Heckler. He wrote the main book on the bridge at Remagen, on which the movie was made. So I knew a lot about it. So we asked the captain and the cruise director, I can't believe we're just going to blow right by the bridge at Remagen. This was the last bridge standing across the Rhine, right? That Hitler was trying to blow up, and our men were racing to get to it. Our first men arrived at the bridge the very minute it was supposed to be blown up, and they seized the bridge, killed the Nazis, and held the bridge. For 2 days afterward, a couple thousand Americans, trucks, and tanks crossed the bridge, and then it collapsed. Regrettably, it collapsed with dozens of engineers trying to save it, and they lost their lives. So they accommodated Claudia and I, and allowed us to, they stopped at the bridge at Remagen. We also were going by the bridge too far. Remember that movie, everybody? Another important movie that's in the Netherlands, where the British paratroopers were annihilated. Montgomery made a mistake and ignored intelligence, and the Nazis were waiting for him. They docked our boat right right next to that bridge. They took us to all sorts of places that we requested. So that's one of the beautiful things about, these really, as you well know, you guys are travel bugs like Claudia and I. These luxury companies like Uniworld and AMA, they accommodate you by going to different spots. I made, I think, what would you say, Claudia, maybe 3 recommendations for both trips, and they accommodated all of them. And about 7 years ago, I did this Jewish Heritage Tour. I led it on the Danube, the one that we're going to do in 2 summers. And I think I made 3 requests of AMA, and they accommodated all of them. So, so I really read up, do my homework, and I put together for Claudia on all of our groups, I put together a list of all the places we're going to go to. And then I lecture about them the day before. So we have the background, we have the history, and hopefully that'll help bring them to life when we go there.
We also give suggested readings. You give them suggested books to read prior to the trip too.
So I brought along Bridge at Remagen, the movie. I brought along A Bridge Too Far. I brought along The Longest Day. I bring movies and I give suggested readings. So I sent out to everybody. I recommended on our D-Day trip that they read Stephen Ambrose. Why? Because it's not only an award-winning book, and it's my favorite book on D-Day, but it's easy to read. It's quick. It's helpful. And then I also brought, for example, I collected the copies of about 24 letters from Eisenhower, Montgomery, Rommel. So I had the letters and I put them in a folder and left them at the concierge at the desk. So if anybody wanted to read the actual letters about, including Eisenhower's speech that he gave to the soldiers when they were ready to go, he had 2 letters, one in each pocket. One that he read everybody to go. The other letter was if D-Day went south. If it didn't work, he was going to accept full responsibility and resign. So I put all these out for everybody to read. So yeah, thanks, Claudia, for reminding me. We like to bring along all those little tidbits to enhance the trip. And then I go on all the tours with everybody too. They can't get rid of me that quickly. And then of course I don't shut up the entire time. So you can wear earplugs, Gary, if you ever tour with me. You're welcome to put earplugs in.
It's one of the things I remember when we went to Budapest is somewhere out away from the city, they had all the statues of all the communists. And that's where they stored all their history.
Yeah. Yeah. And then what I love memorial with all the shoes on the edge of the river, I thought it was just so jaw-droppingly powerful. And it's different from most other memorials, right, everybody? To the folks that were killed during the Holocaust and the war there. And I used it the first time we went, I used it as a teachable moment, as I always do for my own kids. They were young, and I told them, we're going to go see this really strange memorial. And they're like, Dad, not another memorial. You know, when dad becomes like 3 or 4 syllables, dad. And so we walked up, and I didn't tell them what it was about. And they walked up and they saw the shoes, and everybody's standing quietly around them, and they thought it was just something. And I said, see if you can find women's shoes. See if you can find men's shoes. Find shoes that kids could wear. Find some that you could wear. And so they're running around doing all this. Count them. How many pairs are there? And then after they all came back to do that, I had them sit down and I said, now let Dad tell you why they're there. And I had their attention, and it was one of those, it had the desired effect. So to me, it was a wonderful teachable moment to really get my kids to understand the power of the Holocaust, even though they've been to the Yad Vashem, they've been to the Holocaust Museum, they've been to all that. But it was a beautiful teachable moment. Yeah, thanks, Gary. Claudia, anything you want to add to this for us, or something I'm missing, forgetting?
You don't forget anything. So
I do.
no. But the Uniworld we chartered, so we have the entire ship. We custom curate a lot of the excursions. Everybody that's on the ship is one of us. And with AMA, it looks like we might have a group, and it's not technically a Jewish Heritage cruise, but they will add extra excursions just for our group. And I'll find out what those are pretty soon.
I'm putting a list together of all the Jewish heritage sites in the lower Danube, you know, Romania, Bulgaria, through the Iron Gates. And I will have that list available, and will notify AMA ahead of time, who, as Claudia said to accommodate us. And I'll also provide it to all of our passengers, should they want, if they get tired of vineyards and they get tired of, you know, making pasta by hand and museums, you know, we can build in all that as well as. So I intend to try to get a couple of really powerful and important Jewish heritage sites, and I'll go on some of those tours on the lower. I'm going to go on all of them, of course, on the upper Danube, but on the lower Danube, I'll probably go half and half.
Dr. Watson, question. What do you think of President-elect Biden's making a special Secretary of the Environment with John Kerry? Do you think that will help preserve some of the traveling places we go to?
Yeah, Greece won't be underwater for our Israel Santorini trip, because she's ready to hit Mykonos, and I'm ready to eat there with her. So far, I really like Biden's appointments for a couple of reasons. Number one, the diversity. I have always felt that for a government in a democracy to have legitimacy, the government needs to look a lot like the people it governs. And George W. Bush did a good job. Bill Clinton did a good job. Obama did a great job with diversity. Trump really did a horrible job. So I'm glad that there's a lot of diversity. Secondly, Biden's picks are moderates. I'm very pleased that he's, you know, ultimately the 50-yard line is probably where we can govern best. So he's resisted the urge, whether you like him or not, of bringing in sort of the Bernie, Elizabeth Warren faction, very, very moderate, centrist selections. Third, rather than get the high-profile names, Biden has gone for experience over a glitzy name. Now, a lot of the Democrats that ran for president, there'll be jobs waiting for, you know, Mayor Pete, Beto O'Rourke, all of them. But for now, Biden is taking seasoned, experienced, centrist, competent people over big names, which is impressive. John Kerry is a great pick for a special envoy, or, you know, his czar, if you will, on the environment. Kerry was a Secretary of State, knows most world leaders, is well versed on the issue. And what that'll do, Gary, is this. When all presidents, there's 15 cabinet departments: State, Treasury, Commerce, Homeland Security, Agriculture, Labor, yada, yada, yada. So you have your cabinet, but all presidents have honorary cabinet positions. those are agencies that are invited to all the cabinet meetings. So they have stature, they have access, they have bigger staffs. So for example, Barack Obama added EPA, the EPA to honorary cabinet status. And then Trump removed the EPA from honorary cabinet status. Bill Clinton had added like a gun control czar. And then when W came in, he removed it and put in there the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, the prayer group. So, so all that elevates or whatever. So what we've seen under the Obama years is by the EPA having honorary cabinet status, they were able to be far more effective than otherwise. So with now, not only will Biden give them honorary status, but with John Kerry as a special envoy, I think that will help. Donald Trump, whether you agree or disagree is up to you, but he gutted the enforcement of the Clean Air Act, gutted the enforcement of the Clean Water Act. In fact, what they measure clean air as is ppms, particulate matters per million. So the threshold that because there's no such thing as no pollution, every exhaust pipe or every factory smokestack. But the number of particulate matters per million, he just increased it by many, many fold, thus allowing an unbelievable amount of air pollution. He also, the chemical companies were required by law for years, decades, to notify people in the area of any dangers of living near a chemical factory. He removed that law. The chemical factories don't have to do that. The EPA is not allowed under Trump to regulate streams and creeks, only large rivers, which means a lot of waterways are, we're not regulated for the last 4 years. Also, mountaintop removal, if you're familiar with that, when they cut the top of the mountain off in West Virginia, and all the ores and the industrial processes, it runs out, it gets into the underground aquifer, gets in the river. There was a limit on how much runoff you could have from that. Trump ended that, and there was unlimited amount of runoff and pollution from mountaintop removal. Coal ash can be toxic. There was a limit on how much coal ash and where it could be dumped. Trump removed that. You were allowed to produce an unlimited amount of coal ash and put it wherever the F you wanted. So a lot of this stuff, which is just off the charts. So by elevating Kerry, by creating a czar, and with the stroke of the pen, a lot of these environmental measures, I think, can be renewed. And everybody, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, we all breathe clean air and want clean air. So, so I'm hopeful that, a lot of damage has been done to our ecosystems, but let's hope we can begin to get back in the saddle.
Any other questions?
So Claudia, we're looking at Oceania, Crystal, Azamara, and a couple other lines for our Israel, Greek islands. Now the Caribbean is with Oceania, but I've used all three of those, and we love them a lot.
We could look into Celebrity. I asked Silversea today to look into it because they're the first ones that have 2023 open. So we're going to see everybody that's going to Israel and Greece, and we're going to pick out whatever is the best for our folks.
So as you all know, they don't have the 2023 catalogs out yet, but we've liked all those lines, and they all do Israel. And typically what you get, if you haven't been there on a cruise, they often dock at Haifa, and then you're given 3 days-ish. So one trip is usually to the Golan, Sea of Galilee, etc. One trip to Jerusalem, one to the Red Sea. So you get, 3 full days and nights there in Haifa, typically. But we'll find whichever one has the best deal in terms of attractions, number of days, and we'll pick that one. Well, Claudia will pick it.
No, we'll all pick it.
Keep us informed.
I will. Everybody, thank you. If you have any questions on these topics that I discussed or the cruising, you all can email me. If you have questions for Claudia, I will forward them to her. My email's easy. First initial, last name, rwatson@lynn.edu. Every university is the same, so rwatson@lynn.edu, and I'll be happy to continue the chat or pass anything on to Claudia. Debbie, thank you.
Thank you.
And Jason, good to work with you again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank everybody for coming. Thank Commodore Travel for coming.
Thank
And
you
I
for
hope to
having us.
see the club January 30th, if not before. Good night and stay well, everybody.
Stay safe.